Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of Exploring Our World, where we here at Colonial Williamsburg dive into the minds and experiences of daily life here in the 18th century. My name is Brandon Lyles, and joining me here today is Linwood Tyson and Janice Kennedy, and they're here to talk with us about slavery in the 18th century, and in particular, slavery here in Williamsburg. Linwood and Janice, would you mind taking a moment to tell those watching at home about yourselves?
My name is Janice Kennedy, and I've been working here at Colonial Williamsburg for a little bit over 22 years. And 13 of those years I've been working with school and groups and been working in the buildings. And currently I am the supervisor of the Peyton Randolph House.
Good day. My name is Linwood Tyson. I've been here for 20 years, and I am a site interpreter. I do all the buildings here at Colonial Williamsburg.
Between the two of you, many years of experience and plenty of knowledge. I want to take a moment to remind those of you watching this that if you have questions, please go ahead and post those into the chat. We'll be happy to answer as many of those questions as we possibly can in the time that we have together. But I want to go ahead and start by asking you, about something that most people think about. When a lot of people think about slavery, they think about life on a plantation where there are crops to deal with and so forth. How does that differ from what people are experiencing here within the city in the 18th century?
Well, life on a plantation, folks are being put to the ground, growing the crops, as you said, working the soil. In the city, and a lot of the folks that own plantations and farms have homes, what I would call a townhome, in the cities. And so life is going on in the city as well. So you have your taverns, you have the church, you have the college here, you have the homes in between. And so you have folks who are performing domestic service. They're doing those things, those chores and those activities that help with the day-to-day living.
And when we're talking about those in the city, we do have some folks, such as Peyton Randolph, for example, who have a number of enslaved people on their property. Would you care to talk for just a moment about the enslaved on Peyton's property?
Well, Peyton Randolph has 27 of his 109 enslaved folks living on his property here in town. And so you've got people who are working from opening the door to clean the over 700 panes of windows, which is actually, 1,400 when you wash the front and back. You've got people maybe working the vegetable garden outside, working in the outbuildings like the gardener shack, the granary. You've got your smokehouse, your dairy, your textile building, as well as the kitchen and scullery and laundry. So you have a lot of buildings that house that labor force that's behind the Peyton Randolph House. So here in the capital city, just as Peyton Randolph has those people working there, you have folks who are behind all these buildings who provide the labor for the buildings that you see up front.
Now, you mentioned that there are 27 enslaved people on that property. How do we know that there are that many people on the Peyton Randolph property?
Well, there's actually a written inventory with a listing of people's names such as Moses and Betty and Roger and Bratches and all the folks that are there on their property. There's an inventory listing, and not only does it have their name, but it also has their assessed value.
And Brandon, I would like to add that when you talk about your question about the differences, when you come into the city, it's a community. And in that community, you have to understand that everyone is doing everything. So you have those of the enslaved population, you have those who are not enslaved that are of African descent as well. And because of that, when you come into this town, come and visit us and realize that when you look at that Cooper is also someone of African descent. When you look at that one who's up there on that carriage, of African descent. Look at the town itself. The town is populated with people. Peyton Randolph has 27 enslaved people. Mr. George Smith has about 10 or 12 or 15. But understand, it's not the number of enslaved people, because when you think about this, those enslaved people cost money. Can you afford it? And there are so many folks here that cannot afford an enslaved person. They're quite expensive. And understand that not everyone here is a slave.
Thank you. That's important information to
It
keep
is
in
indeed,
mind.
sir.
We do have a question here from David. David asks, were there any jobs that slaves were prevented from doing?
Again, the answer to your question, David, is the fact that no. Cooper, perhaps they are working as the milliner. Perhaps they are the ones who's doing the painting. Carpenters, well, they may not be the expert carpenter, but they're assisting the carpenter. And so when you think about this town, David, when you come here, what you don't see is that the 18th century provides us an opportunity that this is a community, and it's a community of many. Some are enslaved, some are not. But understand our presence is here, and we are sharing in this community.
Absolutely. And, we have a question here from Monique. This is an interesting question. Monique asks, do you feel a connection with Williamsburg and possibly the spirits of slaves, since you have been reenacting for so many years? I know Janice has a deep connection to Williamsburg in particular.
I certainly feel a connection, and it grows stronger the longer I'm here. Not knowing a whole lot of the details that I want to know, but being able to now take the years and events and things that were going on. I can look at the Peyton Randolph house and think about the year that it was first built. I can think about the year when it was added on to, modified. And I relate it to the years of some of my grandparents or great-grandparents who I know were here in James City County, or what was called James City Parish, or Williamsburg, or St. Peter's and New Kent. And so I know that with those years and the events going on, that those people were here putting their hands to the farming, maybe growing crops that would have been used to support as the College of Women Mary. They might have been laying the foundations of some of these buildings or making the bricks. The thing is just to decide and find out who did what. But my family has always been here, so I know that their imprint is here in this town.
In addition to that, Monique, understand that the first thing of responsibility of working here is when you're portraying someone of the past, or whether you are African American, you're interpreting history and you're telling your story. Without our presence here, we would not be heard. So the ideal is this: when you come here, don't be ashamed of your past, of our ancestry. These folks had to survive, and survival is the most important thing. When you go through something and you come out on the other side of it, Monique, it gives you authority, it gives you power. Never think that you don't matter. You always do. And that's what this history is about, sharing those stories. And tell it from a place of passion, because each and every person that comes here, they have to remove themselves from that past and understand that past provides you with your future.
Important words. We have a question here from Mandy. Mandy asks, was there an effort for slaves to escape from cities like there was from plantations, like the Underground Railroad?
I wouldn't call it so much an Underground Railroad that we know of, so to speak, but there's these people, those that are in the city and out in the rural areas, there's a connection, and they create a communication line. They all have access to different information. And so there's a sharing that happens when people happen to be in town, when someone's carting goods into town, or somebody's running errands. People are passing information back and forth. And in that way, they do let folks know when there's a possibility or when something's going to come about, which will allow an opportunity for someone to maybe make a move. Maybe someone's been sitting and waiting for a time and opportunity for a boat to come in or whatever. And when they find out that that time is presenting itself, then they might decide, well, this is my time to make my move. But these people are communicating with each other. And so they pass that information back and forth and keep each other informed of what's happening.
And indeed, Janice, think about the fact that if you're running away, you run away from something. The ideal is that when you are running away from something. It's something that you want to get away from. And what reason? Perhaps you're running to something. Mm-hmm. Imagine the fact that when you come here and you see these individuals, you say, well, my wife is on another plantation. They moved me away from the city of Williamsburg. I want to go back there. So you're running to something, you're running from something. But this ideal is that people run from the city, from the plantations. People are seeking something quite different what they are experiencing. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the enslaved who are running. Think about those apprentices also who are running away. They don't want to be the tailor. They don't want to have to learn to be a carpenter. I'm running away from something. And there's always ads looking for someone who's saying, I moved away, I went without permission. And now this relationship, this community, it's not just the enslaved. And apprentices also have a tendency to run away.
And we do see a fair amount of runaway ads in the Virginia Gazettes all throughout the 18th century.
Indeed.
We have a question here from Donna. Donna asks, were slaves allowed to worship in Bruton Parish Church?
Allowed, sometimes required by their owners to go to church with them. So everybody runs their property in a different way, their household in a different way. And so if your owner requires you to go to church with you, if he thinks it's going to be something that keeps you in line with what he wants from you and keeps you from causing a lot of trouble, then he might require you to go to Bruton Parish Church. There are also people who don't want their slaves to go to church with them and might have someone that comes out on the property on a Sunday, opens up the Bible to a certain page, has them all come and gather in a certain place, and then they'll read from that page to them. And then there are the enslaved folks who from day to day don't need to gather together in their own individual setting by themselves or with others. They will talk about spiritual things or perform spiritual traditions and things, and also gather away from people. If there are people that are out on a rural area, then they might separate and gather at certain times and go into the woods, take the little young tender branches of a bush and bend it over to form a little brush arbor, turn a pan upside down to muffle the sound, which is some of the things they believed in, to keep their voices from carrying, and perform their own ritual or religious circumstances and situation right there.
In fact, I want to add to that, understanding that when you have an enslaved person, that person is considered to be property. And with that, they're being baptized in the Bruton Parish Church. But baptism does not release them from the responsibilities of being enslaved. Mm-hmm. There's a law that's written that states just because you're baptized, just because you're of Christian faith, it does not mean that you're a free individual. Mm-hmm. So that connection and understanding what religion is, it can be adopted, it can be learned, it can be shared. But it also has to be interpreted by those individuals who are experiencing it.
Very good. We have one here from Dusty who says, our family is watching. My children want to know how early slave children had to start working and what kinds of jobs would they be given?
Slave children or children in general have little tiny feet that can walk in between rows without mashing crops and plants. They got little tiny fingers, and they're at the right height to be able to pick worms and bugs off the back of leaves. They can pick up sticks and rocks and things that inhibit plant growth. They can take a gourd that's been carved out, hollowed out to carry water and water plants. They can feed animals. They can shoo the turkeys out of the corn. They can do all those sorts of things. And they can also watch other little children. So once a child is able to understand and take direction, there's always something for that child to do.
Indeed. I want to add that certainly understanding that ideal of young hands and young feet. But what they're learning is from that adult. You see, they're practicing those skills by learning what is responsible. So as they grow older and stronger, they can take over those responsibilities of certainly perhaps Betty, who's the cook over at the Randolph house. Learn those skills because that's what's going to hold that family together. So as a young person, as you mature, you get stronger. But certainly you're learning what you can do at that time. You're learning, you're watching, and you're preparing that one day you may find yourself in that situation where you now may have to become the cook of that house.
Thank you. And we have a question here from Dee. Dee says, I noticed that you use the term enslaved. Mm-hmm. You all have said slaves a couple of times, but seem to use enslaved more. Mm-hmm. Are there differences in those that are important?
Yes.
Well, the term slave is created by the law. A law is written by men who strategize. And so that term, it refers to a condition and an object. Enslaved is a circumstance. And so people, these Africans were people first, always. They are all born free. Everyone's born free with the same rights that are given to you by your Creator that no man or woman can remove. But they use the law to remove those things. And so enslaved is like being imprisoned. You're put in prison and you're put into the institution of slavery, or it is put upon you. So when you say slave, you're thinking about the whole sum of a person, but when you're enslaved, you're referring to a circumstance. It's not their total identity.
I can remember when I first started working here 20 years ago, the term slave was not being used. They used the term servant, manservant, or maiden. The ideal is that when you use terminology such as a slave, you're making it into a person. You're making it into an institution. But when you say enslaved, what Janice makes reference to is that you're being forced into something. You cannot allow someone to place you in that situation. It takes away your humanity. These men who have been given English names like Tom or Jacob, these individuals find themselves in a situation where they're being forced to do this. So that term being enslaved gives it more humanity. It gives us a more sense of they're being forced rather than they're accepting the state in which they find themselves.
Exactly.
And tying into that too, Linwood, Fran has a question that says, has your interpretation changed over the last 20 years? How?
Fran, I've become wiser through having the opportunity to get a little bit wiser. It gives me a more perception of the world around me. Certainly as a young person, you have different perceptions of things. You see things from a different perspective. But as you grow older, you become wiser and you see the world from a different viewpoint. It gives you a more perspective. And so what I've come to realize, Fran, is that when you come here, you come with one perceived ideal, but it is our responsibility to share with you and have you to embrace the ideal that perhaps we were not knowledgeable enough to understand the perception. So time changes everything, gives you a different perspective, and it gives you a love of what you do, because it is what you do, and that is you want to share history and knowledge with as many people as you meet along the way.
All right. We have another question here. This one is from Leslie. Leslie asks, did the enslaved people sleep in the house they were working in or in an outbuilding?
Well, enslaved folks, Leslie, usually living where they're working. So if you were a gardener, you could be possibly in the gardener shack. If you're the laundress, you're going to be above stairs in the laundry or a pallet on the floor there. There are those personal manservant or enslaved manservant and womanservant, as Linwood refers to, who will be on call 24/7, and so they're going to be in the house, maybe on a pallet on the floor at the foot of the bed of the mistress or the master. And so they have to be really close by so they can answer their call at any time of day or night. But most enslaved folks are living where they're working.
And we also have from Anna. Anna asks, were the enslaved people in the community primarily the builders behind all the beautiful architecture we see in Williamsburg?
Well, let me tell you, Anna, we may not have designed it, but we certainly did build it. The ideal is that you can be the architect, you can design it, but that building is not going to be built until you put hands to it. Mm-hmm. And so think about all of these 52% of folks here who are of African descent, some enslaved, some are not. They're going to be the builders. They're going to make those contributions. So you have a designer, but in any building, it has to be built by hands.
And tying into what you just said, we have another question. This one is from Deb, who asks, is it true that Williamsburg's population was about 50% African American in colonial times?
Absolutely, over half the town's population. But I would put it this way. 52.4% of the town's population that you can determine with the eye. Because by this time that we're talking about, relationships have been going on, things have been happening. People are property, people don't have rights, and so they can't control the things or the circumstances that they encounter. And so as time goes on, your black folks don't look so black anymore, and your white folks don't look so white anymore, and people can't tell who's who. And so the law, which is a reactionary thing, will start to determine that people are going to be enslaved or decided that they're enslaved or they have that status based on the law. And the law says the condition of the mother determines the condition of the child. So if your mother's enslaved, you're going to be enslaved. If your mother's free, you're going to be free. So if you think about it, after a while, people start to lighten up and darken up in every way. And so it's a little bit of a mix going on.
Mm-hmm. Think about, think about the fact that if you have a white mother and a black father, is that person enslaved? The mother, she just stated, Janice just told her, you're not a slave, but you are of mixed race. It's called a mulatto. And so with that in mind, those individuals are now being given an opportunity, perhaps because they are not a person that looks like me, but they're a person of mixed race, that individuals can enter into as an apprentice, can learn a skill. So it's not just one or the other. It is a population of people, a community, again, of all people of all colors coming together to understand their circumstances in life.
We also have a question here from Charity, who asks, how were the family units of the slaves of Williamsburg affected by their enslavement?
Well, just the fact that you're enslaved means there's no guarantee of your family. That at any moment, any day, and by anybody's choice who is over you or a Christian, things can happen to separate you all. And there's nothing that you can do to stop it from happening. And so you could have your mother with you one day, and the next day you could wake up and your mother not be there. Your family can't always protect family. And so a lot of times what they would do, if they had an owner that was particularly prone to keep folks together, then they would do everything that they could to be as useful and as skilled as they could, so they would be necessary, so they could maybe bargain with or hope that the owner would listen when they do ask to keep them together in one spot.
And imagine about this, Janice, when someone actually dies and now you're in the wheel. Betty, Eve, or Roger, you're in the wheel, but you didn't pay your debts. And so therefore you may have to sell that enslaved person to pay off one's remaining debts. That breaks up the family. It breaks up the connection. But it also gives us an opportunity to understand that there is no one way of describing this very complicated story. That people are people, and understanding that they're from all walks of life, enslaved, not enslaved, mulattoes, Indians, Native Americans, everyone is here, and everyone is making a contribution to this community.
Thank you for that, Linwood. You folks at home, you are sending in some really, really great questions. Please keep them coming. We have another question here from Jessica, who asks, and I'd like to hear from both of you on this one.
Please.
How often do you have to address serious misconceptions about the lives of enslaved people in Williamsburg?
Every day. Every day. There's someone who, people have their own ideals and things that they've been taught, things they've read, things they've understood, things they've lived. And so what you're doing is you're actually going up against people's foundations and things they've been taught by their parents, by their family, in school, as part of their education or not. And so you allow people to have their own perceptions, their own views, but what you try to do is broaden their focus so they won't be so narrow, open up their scope just a little bit.
And I certainly do agree with everything Janice has said. The idea of that it is every day. But if someone takes the time to spend a few moments with us and they're willing to listen, and we're beginning to have a conversation, it gives us an opportunity to explore that scope that she spoke about, that ideal of that, well, I know what you have learned, and I know what community you come from. There's nothing wrong with what you've learned. Let's just add a little bit more to it. And it is your responsibility to go back and to seek more knowledge. Ask the questions that you just ask us. When you come here to visit with us, don't be afraid to ask questions. If you don't ask the questions, we cannot determine what's on your mind. Be bold enough to ask each and every person here. They have the knowledge, and they will share it with you if you choose to ask. So continue to ask good questions.
Thank you for that, and continue to ask questions as we go along in this program as well.
Indeed.
We're happy to answer those. We have another question here. This one is from Donna. Donna asks, what couldn't an enslaved person do that a free one could?
Well, that's a court question there. That's a good question there. Think about the fact that we have a county court here. And in that county court, understand if you are a person who is not enslaved, we'll give you an opportunity to steal 5 pounds or have something where 5 pounds is a great deal of money. It's not a felony. But think about the person who is enslaved or the person of African descent. I mean, we don't talk about 5 shillings. There's a big difference there, isn't it? So the ideal is that we commit a crime and we're going to be punished for the same crime, but it's going to certainly be a whole lot less than that white person here. But remember, the courts are not just set up for those of the county level that's dealing with this, just the general population. Those who are enslaved are also going to that county court. And they're dealing with those misdemeanors. And they're being tried for those felonies as well. So think about the fact that one person can do something for 5 shillings, you're going to be punished. But someone else does it for 5 pounds. Well, that's a great deal of money. So understanding that the laws are in place, they're being written down, they have to be laws that we have to abide by, but we do understand that there is a difference.
Just as there is today. So we hear what Linwood is saying, but for me, it takes my mind to our present circumstances today. We are experiencing things today in our world that comes from and can be traced back to those laws written back at the time that we're talking about. Those things have followed us from generation to generation. And so you think about people who've grown up with those ideals from generation to generation and who are your lawmakers and your legislators. And so some of those mindsets creep into our government today.
I do want to throw in a follow-up question on this as well. Were there any protections for enslaved persons that weren't available for free persons of color?
Well, think about this. If a person has found himself being enslaved, that means you're someone else's property. I can't take your property and destroy it. That means that even if I go to that county court and I'm found guilty of a felony crime, if I have to go to the gallows, who's going to be compensated for that? That master. Mm-hmm. So this system is set up where that no matter who you are, if you are an enslaved person, understanding that you belong to someone else. Someone told you that you belong to me. Think about that enslaved person understanding that I belong to someone else, but I also belong to myself. My values, my virtues, my importance. And I know who I am. I might have found myself in this situation, but you know, one day, my hope is like anyone else. I, too, have a desire to be free.
We're going to dive into a little bit of a more personal question about interpretation and so forth. Joy asks, as an interpreter of enslaved persons, have visitors sometimes treated you disrespectfully? If so, how do you handle this?
I personally just take a breath and try to remember what I'm here for, and that if I don't handle it right, I could run the person off and close them off. But it's hard to separate your humanity from that moment, because you're always human in that moment, and you have feelings, and those feelings come with you. So it's hard to divorce yourself of that in that moment. I think your feelings show up even more when you feel like you're being disrespected. So what I try to do is remember what I was told and how I was raised. I never let anyone make me go down lower than I have to. And so whatever it takes for me to hold myself together, I know who I am, I know whose I am, and I know why I'm there. And if I'm there to be the voice of those people who didn't have a voice, it's important for me to take time to assess the situation and not reject the person's comment, but entertain it and talk to them in a way that will make them think twice about what they said and how they said it when they walk away. I want them to walk away thinking about what they said to me, not me thinking about what I said to them.
Joy, each and every person that comes to this city of Williamsburg to engage in conversation, they are certainly coming with their own beliefs and their own opinions. I can't go back and change what their opinions are. I can only give them an opportunity to voice their opinions. And my goal is to say to them, I understand why you think that way, but have you paused a bit to think about that person who's experiencing? Many people come believing that the revolution was all about Peyton Randolph or John Randolph or George Washington. Can you imagine how those who are enslaved, truly enslaved, how they must have felt So you share that story, you make that connection, you step back from the time that we are experiencing now and have them to relate that everyone has dignity, everyone has a story to tell, you just have to listen to it.
We have another question here from Monique. Monique says, I also noticed the clothing you are both wearing. Were slaves provided with these garments? I see in history books it's mainly rags and in later years of slavery.
You take that, Janice? I see she have a smile on your face, yes?
Yep.
You're someone's property, and so they provide your covering, just like they provide your food, those things that sustain you. Depending on where you are, if you're in the field, then you don't have to be dressed. You have to be dressed, but not fashionably. So you represent your job and where you are, what you're doing. If you're someone who's going to be traveling around the town, like John Harris, who's traveling with Mr. Randolph, or Eve, who's going about the town with Mrs. Randolph or running errands for from her, and people identify when they see Eve as being Mrs. Randolph's woman servant, or whatever you want to call her. I call her second shadow. That she's her walking money, and she has to look really, really good. And so that's going to make a difference because they are a reflection of that person's wealth that owns them. So as far as rags, sometimes you would find people in rags or in tattered and torn garments. We have people, travelers, who came and documented how they found people on Mr. Washington's property, the children that weren't dressed so well, and it wasn't a season when you could be out there with rags on. You were exposed to the element and to the weather. So the situations and what you would have on how they would dress you, it's all based on who your owner is and how he values his property.
Indeed. Can you imagine coming to the governor's palace, seeing someone dressed in rags, wearing livery clothing, a wig, making that impression upon the royal governor, or coming to the governor's palace, or someone who's serving Ben, such as serving George Whip? Can you imagine him in rags? He's guiding Mr. Whip's carriage, and now he's in rags. So understand that one's dress is based on what station one has in life. But if you're an enslaved person, are you aware that you can receive some tips? I might go out and buy me a nice pair of buckle shoes. Might get me a fancy hat. That already pushes me up in elevation with others who respect me. But understand that clothing gives you an outside appearance. It doesn't really change who you are. So if you're working on a plantation and you're out there working in the field, do you need some fancy clothes on to do that? Think about the person who's walking in this town behind that oxen. How good does he have to look? And how good does he have to smell as well? And people are coming here from all walks of life. Does everyone come here dressed fancy? Can you imagine those orphans? Can you imagine those folks who are suffering, those folks who are working? I'm sure many of them wore some rags as well, not just those who were enslaved.
Thank you for that. And we also, we had several questions about clothing that I think you covered with what you just answered. So questions from Liam and Karen as well. We have some questions here about health care. Lisa, this is from both Lisa and Donna, who provided daily health care? And if you were enslaved, did you have access to medical care?
Well, there are enslaved people on the property. If you're in a rural area, it might not be a situation where the owner's going to bring someone in to take care of you. There are people on the property, the elders, and some have knowledge of herbs and things to use, poultices and things, medicines they put together from herbs and mixing up different concoctions from knowledge from the elders that taught them, that they brought with them from the continent of Africa. So some of them will take care of the health and maintain and look after the enslaved folks on the property. You come into the city, and there are folks like Mrs. Randolph who might very well call in her own personal physician or doctor to come and see after those people that are there on the property.
In addition to that, there are books that are written. You know, I'm my own doctor. So if you can read, you can read what you need to take to help a person to survive. You also have instances where when you're talking about an enslaved population, you might have a midwife right there. You're talking about smallpox. Oh, I know how to take care of that. That comes from my country. I know how to be inoculated to cure myself. And sometimes the master will rely on that enslaved person to practice medicine. And so if he practices it, you want to make sure that he's given permission to do so, because he will turn to him sometimes before he turns to the local folk here who's supposed to be doctors and to the apothecary. So very knowledgeable people who have knowledge of their circumstances, and they treat each other because it's all about survival.
Thank you. And let's talk a little bit about education as well. Heather is asking, was formal education available to enslaved persons depending upon their working responsibilities?
Each and every person here, when you speak of education, is education from a book or is it from learning from someone who has superior knowledge? If I have to learn how to take care of laundry, I may not be able to read or write it. But certainly Charlotte over at the Randolph, for example, she knows how to do it. So education is not always book learning. Sometimes it's through experience. Sometimes it's through watching others. You learn those skills. If I have to cook a meal, do I learn it from reading the recipe book or do I learn it from practice? Now, remember, in the city, there is no restrictions of reading and writing. Not everybody can accomplish that. But we know nearby in the city of Williamsburg, there will be a Bray School here. And at that Bray School, Mrs. Ann Wagger has an opportunity to teach those who are enslaved and those who are not. And you're teaching the basic reading, writing, catechisms, doing a little bit of cycling as well. So the opportunity to learn, but not everybody can read and write, no matter who you are. And so to remind us that education, not just from books, but it's from experience.
And we have a question here from Lester. Lester asks, were enslaved persons allowed any personal possessions?
Well, no one can keep you from having possessions unless they're watching you all the time. You might have to hide something, or sometimes hide it in plain sight. But we know through archaeological digs and excavations that they did find what we call like little holes in the ground where enslaved folks would put little things, little tokens that meant something to them. But like Linwood said, these people are working on the side, getting tips sometimes, and so you take that tip, and if your daughter wants a little ribbon to put in her hair, or if a gentleman wants to buy something for his wife, if he has a wife there with him, or you want a hat for your head and you have that money that you've earned, then you can very well go to the market place and buy some little token or something that makes you feel good about yourself and gives you a little agency over your life, and hopefully you'll be allowed to keep it.
We have another question here. This was from Amy. Do the enslaved really accept their fate?
No. Enslavement is not a natural state of being, and the reason there's always pushback, the reason that there's concern and there are laws, is that's evidence these people don't accept their condition or their fate. They accept the fact that it might not be within their generation that they seek, that they will receive that freedom that they think about, dream about, and speak about. But it's for the generations to come. So a lot of times they resign themselves to teaching those younger folks, the generations coming up, how to survive the institution of slavery and how to dream those dreams that might not manifest in their lifetime, but in their children's lifetime. So I believe that I am the enslaved person's dream. It was me that they were dreaming about and me that they were saving themselves for and trying to survive for.
May I add to the fact that if you go back to when folks are being brought against their will from Africa, and that middle passage that many of you are familiar with, some folks jumped overboard. Mm-hmm. Some folks chose death over being enslaved. Some people fought for their freedom on that ship long before it arrived to what we call this America. Mm-hmm. You see, when you find yourself in a situation such as being an enslaved person and being someone else's property, you can make a choice. You can give up, or you could try to survive for the next generation. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we are here, we're telling this story. Somewhere down the line, our ancestors chose to survive. In any situation you find yourselves in, you must survive. This revolution is not going to stop with Peyton Randolph or George Washington. It will extend themselves to those who are truly enslaved.
And Gabby asks, are there resources available for the descendants of enslaved folks to find their relatives?
Janice, I'll let you answer that.
I was going to hand it to you. Resources. What do you mean when you say resources? Trying to find who you are, if there aren't records and no one's ever told you, it's like looking for the rabbit that went down the rabbit hole. You know it's there somewhere, but you don't know how deep the hole is, and don't know if you can dig until you get to where there's some light. I'm in that hole right now, trying to find people, and constantly run up against the wall. You're digging and you're trying to get past it, but you don't know where to go to get the answer that you're looking for. It's out there. And sometimes it's right in front of you, but you just have to keep going back to the same pieces. I know I do, the same pieces of papers and dates and information, and read it and reread it. And sometimes it sounds crazy, but sometimes something will pop up that was always there that you just didn't see because it wasn't meant for you to see it in that moment. So that's just my personal experience with it. But yeah, there are resources, but you got to have the patience, the endurance, and the time for it.
And of course, Janice, now that you have more opportunities with this, what we call this modern technology, you folks can certainly explore better than I can. But understand, if you never have an opportunity to discover your past, always plan for your future. So you are creating that story that you're telling your children, the grandchildren, whoever you come in contact with. Give them a legacy so that they can say, I remember you. You can start it with you. Because sometimes people just don't want to talk about their past. And so the idea is that that past is important, but what's important is your future. Keep seeking, keep searching, and if you are one of those, as Janice has suggested, lucky enough to find it, don't forget to share it.
Well, we're nearly out of time, but I do want to ask one more question that's come through from Aaron. Aaron asks, was it possible to free a slave?
Think about this revolution. As this revolution approaches, we understand these ideals written primarily by Mr. Jefferson. Perhaps you know them well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, with that awakening of that revolution, you must understand that there are those who understood those words, and manumission becomes a part of the time period. Mm-hmm. And so I was reading something just the other day where it suggested because of this revolution, 100,000 folks are now being released from their bondage. We have a large community of people because now you don't have those restrictions of who you can and cannot manumit. So this ideal, this opportunity of this revolution, it extends itself all the way to those who are enslaved, and everything's about to change. It challenged this ideal of equality. It challenged these ideals of independence and freedom. Those words are also being heard for those who are truly enslaved, and there will be those who will take action to manumit as many as possible.
Thank you. And we are nearly out of time, so I do want to take a moment and ask if either of you have any parting thoughts for those who are watching at home.
Come to Colonial Williamsburg. We're waiting for you. Bring your questions, bring your concerns, bring your perspectives, bring an open mind, and just be willing to have the conversation with us, because we can learn a lot by engaging with each other.
Each and every day we're here, we learn something different. And it is your responsibility, and hopefully in the near future, come and join us. But don't be afraid to engage in conversation. Challenge what you already know. Add to it. And imagine yourselves taking that step back in time. We thank you for joining us, coming into our lives. We've come into yours. And come and see us. Come and spend some time with us here at Colonial Williamsburg.
And unfortunately, that is all the time we have available for today. I want to say thank you very much to Linwood and Janice for sharing this enlightening information. I also want to say thank you to all of you who are watching this out there, all of you who asked questions throughout. And I also want to take a moment to give a special thanks to our donors. It's because of people like you that we're able to do these programs and many of the other programs that we have happening here at Colonial Williamsburg that we would not be able to do without your support. We are so glad you could watch with us today. Please come visit us in Colonial Williamsburg soon. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.